What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper, here to talk to you about the best decks for you to rank up in Marvel Snap. First up, it's finally not Loki. This hybrid of Annihilus and DH Bounce has become my favorite deck in the game, and of course, it's become a very successful deck ever since I did my video on it after the auto builder built it for me. So I tend to call this deck Jarvis after the auto builder in Marvel Snap, which is of course not named Jarvis, but you get where I'm going with this. So this list focuses on using just some of the best cards in the game, the Bounce Shell with Werewolf by Night, with a new-ish top end. After the loss of America Chavez, the Bounce Shell was in search of a different direction to go. America Chavez allowed you to rely on things like having Beast and Falcon early and not drawing them on turn 6 when they're totally terrible. And so it lets you sort of skimp on having actual power in the deck because you were doing your synergy things so much more often. Now that that's not true, you need to have some actual beef in the deck, some cards that you're happy to draw on the final turns of the game. And the best way to do this is to hybridize the Annihilus bounce with the DH bounce, because that way you have not just DH, but also cards like Sentry, Shadow King, Annihilus that you're very happy to draw on turn 6, and you're going to be very, very happy to see those cards when they show up, and it's not an America Chavez. Now, this is a list that has been around. Multiple people have played this. I know Torikun played this list before Chavez was actually out of the picture, and I will say, I think that was probably bad. When we could play Chavez, we could play better versions than this, but now that we can't play Chavez, we have to adapt to this brave new world, and this is, for me, the best deck in the game right now. Over 1,500 post-infinite, which is to say no robot games. There is a win rate on Untapped of this deck of about 60%. That is unbelievable for a sample size that large. It is very, 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 very hard to get to that level. I have seen people making modifications like taking out Spider-Ham, which I don't endorse because I think, the more videos I do on this, the more mirrors there are going to be, the better Spider-Ham is going to be. And I've also seen people taking out the Rock Slide for Falcon, which I think is actually a totally defensible and even good decision. But that is the flex spot that I would stick with for right now. Now, you can flex out, Rock Slide for Falcon. I have no issues with that. And I think there are also some other iterations of the bounce deck that may show up on this tier list as well. That said, this is what I think is the current best deck in the game, and it's finally not Loki, so, cheers to that. So, yes, Loki, finally, I think, not the best deck in the game, especially right now where less people are playing it than it even deserves, because I think that as soon as people realized there was another deck they could be playing and getting the same results, people that have been playing Loki for the past 2 months are like, oh, finally, I can play something else. And they are doing that. So I would say Loki's actually a little bit underrepresented right now compared to its power level. Still, Loki is a very strong deck, and I think at minimum it will fall into a range of mid-range killer. And I think that's a very, very important point to make. Like, even if Loki is not the best deck in the game, it will still be a very viable metagame pick when enough decks that are weak to what it does end up constructing what we see as the metagame. Loki, I think, is still very, very strong. This is my current build of the list, and I consider there to be one major flex slot and then 2 minor flex slots. The major flex slot is I have a Sentinel, and I know a lot of other people have a Beast. I don't really have a huge preference as to which of those you decide to play. I am very iffy and always have been very iffy on Beast and Loki. I feel like it adds a level of complexity that isn't entirely necessary, and I don't think you get the same payoff from playing a Beast and Loki that you do in the bounce deck because you're not really a good deck at using the hood. That said, I think it's a totally fine and defensible choice to make. If you want to play Beast over Sentinel, I have no issues with that. Another thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is what to do in my 2 tech slots. We have, of course, Rogue and Shang-Chi in this build, but you could do a ton of stuff, right? You could play Shadow King, you could play Cosmo. Those tech slots can be whatever you want them to be, and I truly do encourage you to customize them to the metagame that you are seeing. Finally, on the subject of Loki, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is, can we go back to hybridizing Loki with something else? Can we hybridize Loki with, like, Quinjet She-Hulk Moon Girl? Can we hybridize Loki with Devil Dinosaur again? I kind of don't know. Loki, for the past 2 months, has been carried by being hybridized by other decks, right? It was a hybrid Elsa deck. Now it's a hybrid werewolf deck. And I'm wondering if, as no longer it is the best hybrid werewolf deck, maybe there's another hybridization that it could make that could bring it back into prominence. It's definitely something I'm going to be looking into, but until I have something concrete to show you, this is the Loki list that I'll be playing. Destroy has been a very viable deck for the past few months, and I consider it still an extremely powerful one, especially since it wasn't actually changed by the America Chavez nerf slash rework, whatever you want to call it. The decks that weren't affected by the Chavez rework are the ones that are going to be the strongest, I think, coming out of the gate, because every other deck is going to have to adjust. We're lucky that decks like Darkhawk Bounce and Nihilus Bounce were able to adjust by hybridizing with each other. That said, it's still a good decision to say, take a deck that didn't have to adjust at all. And I think Destroy is definitely a deck that didn't have to adjust at all. And that is a very good thing. Destroy is a consistent performer that already got its 12th card a few months ago in the form of X23. Now, I do think there are a couple specifics about this list that are worth talking about. As you can see, your general 2 Destroy flex slots are occupied by Deathlock and, of course, Taskmaster. Now, the reason for that is that I prefer Deathlock right now as a sort of in deference to the amount of people that are playing Annihilus, and of course, Deathlock as an extra Destroy trigger is pretty good in those matchups, because you're going to need those Destroy triggers not just to activate your game plan with Deadpool, but also to get rid of their stuff. As far as Taskmaster, I think that's actually a little bit less clear-cut, but I have gone with Taskmaster because you can try to lose priority, play a big Deadpool and a Taskmaster, and then you won't be vulnerable to the Shadow King. Of course, other cards in your deck that are not vulnerable to Shadow King include Null and Death. So this is actually a deck that has some play against Shadow King, despite the fact that like 6 cards in the deck are actually vulnerable to it. You can deal with it. There are lines that can give you, a relatively favored matchup into it. One of the things that this deck actually struggles with, though, is having itself disrupted, which is part of why Nico Minoru is so important. Her draw 2 ability really enables you to get to your nut draw as much as you possibly can, and the Destroy nut draw, once you start rolling downhill, is one of the strongest possible things you can do in the game, and one of the hardest to interact with because of the different ways in which it can set itself up. It can be a priority deck, or it can be a deck that throws priority entirely and plays like a 28 power Deadpool and like a 28 power Taskmaster. Like, it can be anything from doing the final turn as like a Shuri gamer, or like just getting really ahead with a giant Venom and then making your final turn like Deadpool and Null. Like, it's a very, very flexible deck in terms of game plan, as long as it has those options. And so Nico Draw 2 is a snap condition for you a lot of the time because of how powerful it is. Just make sure you don't get Black Widowed. This deck, which I affectionately like to refer to as Cheatyhawk, I believe was popularized by Dexter, but I do think I saw it a couple places before Dexter got to it. I'm not 100% sure, though. I just generally try to track that stuff down. I was unable to track it down in this case. That said, it is a very straightforward and interesting build of Darkhawk that is very focused on cheating energy with Ravonna, with Moongirl and Quinjet, and of course with Zabu. You're ending up playing a lot of cards on the final turn of the game. One of the interesting things about this list, though, and I think perhaps the most interesting, and not necessarily in a good way, is we all sort of acknowledge that Mobius M. Mobius was a pretty bad answer to Loki, but it's a very good answer to stuff like this. Now, the reason Mobius is a bad answer to Loki is because Loki as itself still pumps the collector. It still does the Loki thing. And it's also like good stats on curve. This discrepancy and the sheer volume of cards that this deck invests into getting the discounts makes it much, much more vulnerable to Mobius than it otherwise would be. And that is a very, clear weakness to have. And it's a weakness that other builds of similar decks are taking advantage of. For example, this is like the old school Hawk build, and I would imagine that it's very, very difficult for you to beat a resolved Mobius in the mirror between these two decks, right? Like, this is sort of where the actual utility of a card like Mobius can be seen, because it's not at its best against Loki. Where Mobius is at its best is against every discount card in the game that isn't Loki. And this is a metagame where Mobius really gets to shine. Miss Marvel Darkhawk is an extremely powerful thing to be doing. I think this deck might actually be going a little bit under the radar in terms of being able to compete with the best decks in the game, because it is still absurdly strong to play things like Miss Marvel and Darkhawk and just have this powerful disruptive strategy welded to a powerful body strategy. It's just a classic way to be good at the game of Marvel Snap. This is a classic deck, and as much as I call it old school, I think it very much could be one of the best decks in the game. In terms of customization, I've seen builds of this that hybridize with Annihilus, and I think that's the main branch off that you'll see. I've also seen some builds of this that are like halfway between this and the Quinjet build that are using things like She-Hulk. I personally think if you're going to go one way or the other, you kind of have to choose. You either go this way with the Mobius or the other way and go full cheat. But generally speaking, if you made me choose between them, I would rather be playing this build. Another deck that Mobius is very good against is the SheNaut archetype, which is back in, I would say, like a relatively minor way. Like, this is a deck that you'll have to respect, but it's not one that I have a huge premium on because of the ways in which it is relatively easy to disrupt it. And I think especially if it becomes a like dominant top deck, it ends up in a situation where it is relatively easy to hate it out. Cards like Snow Guard being popular, obviously very bad for this. People can play Legion again, and that's very bad for this. Like, you see, we run a Cosmo in order to prevent our lane from being turned off, but that doesn't even really work against cards like Snow Guard and Legion, and that is a big problem. That said, this is a very strong proactive strategy. The goal here is, of course, get to a turn 7, skip all your energy on turn 6, pump up your Snow Guard, play a She-Hulk, play an Infinite, or play a She-Hulk and a Giant Hulk. It's a pretty straightforward final turn point slam strategy. Weaknesses include it's very telegraphed. This is a deck that I think is going to win a lot of 2 cubes and then lose a lot of 4 to 8s, because I am not someone who, when I play against this, it's very, very easy to know what they're going to do, because of course they're going to do it. And it's also very, very easy to force your opponent out of a game with a leech because you've just said, oh, well, actually, you can't win this game. So they're going to leave. This is a deck that seems very, very good at getting those 2 cube wins where you snap on something, but not so great at actually surprising your opponents and winning those games that you really end up getting a lot of cube equity out of. Now, is that particularly relevant to how strong the deck is? To some degree, but it's not bad enough to make this a poor choice, in my opinion. It's a deck you can play. I just think that it is a deck that has other options that may be better in terms of cube profile. Like, if you have the choice between this and some of the other decks I mentioned earlier, I might choose those decks instead. That said, this is a powerful final turn strategy that is, of course, deeply hurt by Mobius, and is, of course, yet another reason that I prefer the Mobius build of Darkhawk, because you just get these free wins sometimes against decks like this. Good old Lockdown. This remains a deck, and that might be the nicest thing I can say about it. Like, you can do it if you want. If you want to play a Lockdown deck, you can play a Lockdown deck. I just think that Lockdown is in a much worse space metagame-wise than it was previously, even though it is a list that was, like, totally fine not playing America Chavez. It's still a list that the main reason that it was bad was because of stuff like Annihilus, because of stuff like Miss Marvel, and that's still here. So the reason it's not very good into other Miss Marvel decks is because you're investing in cards like Storm, you're investing in cards like Professor X, and your opponent, meanwhile, is investing in cards that actually have stats, and they also have your Doom and Miss Marvel in order to match your ability to put points on the board. Now, the reason it's bad into Annihilus is because if you ever storm the lane that they can put some negative stuff in, then they play the Annihilus, you end up in this awful situation where they just give you a bunch of crap late in the game, swing the lane that you have stormed, that you were counting on winning. It's pretty tough to actually come out on top in those spots. And that's just like this very, it's just, this is a fine deck and you could play it, but it's not very well positioned in the metagame right now. This is how I think many of the old school Annihilus slash Darkhawk bounce decks should adapt to losing America Chavez. And it's just like, let's just throw a tech card in there and keep the, established core intact, right? So this is basically 11 out of 12, the previous build of Annihilus bounce, except, we now have a Shang-Chi in there. And that's actually very, very good, especially in mirrors, because Shang-Chi's gonna blow up that sentry, and you have an Annihilus to make sure that the other half of the sentry, the Void, doesn't end up on your side of the board. Another card you could play there is Enchantress. I saw this first from a guy named Rutmus, who is a top high elo player, and I think this is a solid version of the deck, especially if you don't want to invest too heavily in the Darkhawk type stuff. I do tend to think it gets a little bit power crept by just the specific build of Darkhawk plus Annihilus that we talked about at the beginning of the video. But I do want to say, like, if you don't have all the cards for that, you don't need it. You can just take your old Darkhawk bounce build, take your old Annihilus bounce build, and put a tech card in there. Totally fine, totally playable. Maybe even long-term it might end up better. Like, I really do want to say, like, I think these bounce decks are phenomenally powerful. And while I do think the best one right now is the one that we talked about at the beginning of the video, these decks are right up there with it. One thing I will say is that as long as Annihilus is a very common card to see, you're not going to want to cut Spider-Ham as much as you're going to want to cut Spider-Ham. Spider-Ham hitting your opponent's Annihilus is, like, you have very few ways of breaking parity other than that, and that is an extremely, extremely strong thing to do, and you're going to want to keep Spider-Ham for that reason, at least in my opinion. Finally, as a great deck builder and innovator, what I have done with Hela is I took out America Chavez and I put in Black Knight. I'm a brilliant, amazing gamer. I'm the smartest person of all time. Now, this is like a very obvious thing to do, but I just wanted to say, like, this is probably what most Hela people that you're going to be seeing are doing. And actually, I think Hela's in like a weirdly good position right now. It's just that it runs into the issue of, boy, there's a lot of rocks and stuff around. And so it's in like a less good position than it was previously, but still like a reasonably good one. I think Hela was a deck that coasted a lot on having like a good Loki matchup, and now it might actually have to justify its own existence on its own terms, which is tough to do, I think. I think there is some worry that it might not be able to do that. That said, like, if you want to go to the casino, I have no issues with you playing a Hela deck. Obviously, there's a reason it's at the end of this list, but that's what the end of this list is for, is to say, like, look, if you run into a Hela person, this is probably what they're doing. And I wanted to shout out, of course, Husky and Rue, who were people who were really working on this list. And by really working on this list, I mean, making the genius move of taking out America Chavez now that she sucks and putting in Black Knight now that his Ebony Blade has amazing card text. Of course, that doesn't mean that Hela can't still beat you. Like, as much as I'm being derisive here, when this deck works, it'll beat you up. All right, y'all. That's going to be it from your boy, the 69th ranked Marvel Snapper in the game. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone who supports me. I cannot stress that enough. I've just been feeling extremely grateful for my community recently, so thank you so much. If you made it this far in the video, remember, click like, click subscribe, turn on notifications, all that stuff. Like, it makes me feel good, and it helps me continue what I'm doing. So I really appreciate that if you do it. And of course, remember, check me out on Twitch. I stream over there as well. And as always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.